Once hailed as the first gentleman of Europe, George IV dazzled the world with glittering clothes, lavish palaces, and endless feasts of music, wine, and art. Yet when death came, his body was swollen with fluid, his chest heaving so violently that he could only sleep upright in a chair. The dashing prince, who once embodied elegance, ended his days as a bloated shadow, despised by his people, remembered not for glory, but for the decay of indulgence. George Augustus. Frederick entered the world on August 12, 1762, inside the stately walls of St. James's Palace in London. His birth was celebrated with fireworks, church bells, and proclamations, for he was the long-awaited heir to the Hanoverian throne. Yet behind the pomp of his christening lurked a chilling truth. The royal household was already fractured by the unpredictable mind of his father, King George III. The young prince grew up under the shadow of madness. His father was prone to violent mood swings, irrational fits, and prolonged periods of confusion that baffled doctors of the age. In such a palace, joy was never pure. Laughter often gave way to whispers about the king's sanity. For George, childhood was a strange mixture of velvet luxury and emotional instability. He was draped in fine silks, educated by the best tutors, and surrounded by gold-trimmed halls. Yet, he also witnessed the terrifying fragility of authority when his father would stumble into delirium, babbling incoherently before courtiers too afraid to look away. This environment shaped him deeply. Unlike his stern, duty-bound father, George sought escape in charm and display. He learned early that appearances could mask turmoil, that a dazzling smile or a fashionable coat could distract from shadows at home. By adolescence, he was already gaining a reputation for elegance and wit, adored by some, envied by others. But beneath the powdered wigs and polished manners, his need for constant distraction was growing, a craving that would define the rest of his life. George was the oldest of 15 children, and his siblings often looked to him for guidance. But the weight of expectation pressed heavily. He was the heir, the one meant to stabilize the dynasty, the golden thread that would hold together a family fraying at its edges. Instead of stability, however, his early years planted the seeds of excess. In the silence after his father's outbursts, George dreamed of grandeur not as service, but as escape. By the time he reached manhood, the young prince was already split in two. Outwardly the picture of refinement, inwardly restless and unmoored. He had inherited his father's crown, but none of his discipline. His father's throne, but not his sense of restraint. What grew in him instead was hunger. Hunger for pleasure, for beauty, for forgetfulness. From the moment he tasted independence, George flung himself into a whirl of excess. London in the late 18th century was alive with masquerade balls, gambling houses, and taverns that stayed open until dawn, and George was their most celebrated guest. As the Prince of Wales, he carried the weight of royal dignity on his shoulders. But he preferred to drape that dignity in velvet cloaks and drown it in champagne. He became infamous for his nights of revelry, where laughter and music spilled out of candlelit halls until the sun broke over the Thames. Women, wine, and wagers consumed his time, and debts piled up faster than even his royal allowance could cover. Parliament intervened more than once to rescue him from financial ruin, a humiliation that scandalized both court and country. To the common people struggling through economic hardship, the image of their prince living beyond his means was bitter proof of a monarchy out of touch. Physically, he indulged to the point of ruin. Rich banquets became routine, and his waistline expanded alongside his appetite for luxury. Politically, he showed little interest in the duties expected of him, preferring the company of actors, artists, and mistresses to that of statesmen. By the time he reached his 20s, George had become a paradox, adored by fashionable society for his charisma, yet despised by many for his irresponsibility. What made his recklessness all the more striking was how openly he embraced it. He wore his debts almost like medals, boasting of his extravagant spending as if it were proof of his sophistication. To his critics, this was arrogance. To George, it was armor. Each debt, each party, each new scandal kept at bay the whispers of madness that haunted his father and the loneliness that gnawed at his own heart. But indulgence cannot quiet fear forever. The young prince was already building a cage of excess around himself, gilded and glittering, yet impossible to escape. What began as youthful pleasure was hardening into lifelong dependence, a pattern of avoidance that would one day consume both his body and his crown. Love, when it first touched George, came not in the form of a grand dynastic alliance, but as a private longing. Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic woman of beauty and quiet dignity, became the prince's greatest passion. Their bond was genuine, tender, and, most fatally, illegal. The Royal Marriages Act required the king's consent for any union, and English law barred heirs to the throne from marrying Catholics. Yet George, consumed by desire, staged a secret ceremony in 1785, pledging his heart to her in defiance of crown and country. For a brief time, he lived as though he had achieved what no palace could give him, a sense of belonging. Maria, unlike the courtiers and flatterers who swirled around him, demanded respect. She softened his edges, steadied his moods, and reminded him of a life beyond extravagance. But it was not to last. The law did not recognize their marriage, and his father never would. When debts and politics pressed him, George abandoned his vows. Parliament forced his hand. He was to wed Caroline of Brunswick, a German princess chosen for alliance rather than affection. Their marriage began in farce and ended in catastrophe. From the very wedding night, George found Caroline repellent, mocking her manners and scorning her presence. Caroline, in turn, exposed his infidelities, mocked his corpulence, and fueled public scandals. The union meant to secure the throne became a circus of humiliation. In this personal failure, the public found theater. Pamphlets ridiculed the royal couple, and caricatures of the drunken prince and his estranged wife circulated freely. George's longing for Maria remained a ghost in his life, a reminder that his one true love was the one thing he could never honor openly. Instead, he was trapped in a marriage that eroded his dignity, fueling the perception that he was a man ruled not by principle, but by appetite. Thus, the tale of George and Maria was more than a romance. It was the moment the heir to the throne revealed how little control he had over his own destiny. The forbidden love gave him solace, but also exposed his weakness. And from it flowed years of scandal that would corrode both his reputation and his reign. When madness overtook King George III in 1811, the empire faced a crisis. The king raved in his chambers, blind, incoherent, and unable to govern. Parliament turned to his son, the long-scorned Prince of Wales, and elevated him as Prince Regent. For 9 years, George held the reins of power in a nation at war with Napoleon and struggling under economic strain. It was a chance for redemption. Here was the moment to transform his image from spoiled prince into steadfast leader. Yet George squandered it. Instead of embodying duty, he reveled in pomp. Regents' banquets dazzled, operas overflowed, and the construction of Brighton's Royal Pavilion continued at staggering cost. Soldiers bled on European battlefields, while their regent waltzed beneath glittering chandeliers. To his critics, this was proof that the monarchy had lost its moral compass. While generals like Wellington carried Britain to victory, George appeared indifferent. His greatest battles fought not in war, but in fashion and gossip. Parliament grumbled about his spending, pamphleteers lampooned his indulgence, and commoners cursed his name in alehouses. Even his victories were hollow. When Napoleon was defeated in 1815, national pride swelled. But little of the glory attached to the regent. He had not led armies, nor inspired the people. He had merely presided from the sidelines, draped in jewels. By the end of his regency, George had become a symbol not of resilience, but of detachment. The crown seemed less a source of unity than a mask behind which he hid his weaknesses. The people expected a monarch forged by crisis. Instead, they saw a man whose indulgence deepened even as the nation sacrificed. His years as regent etched his reputation in stone. A ruler more concerned with appearances than with the arduous business of rule. In 1820, George ascended the throne as King George IV, stepping into a role he had long coveted, yet seemed unfit to bear. At first, his reign dazzled. He adored the stage of monarchy, filling it with glittering costumes, architectural splendor, and elaborate ceremony. He became a patron of the arts, supporting painters like Sir Thomas Lawrence and fostering the design of Regency architecture that would shape London's streets. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton, an exotic palace of domes and minarets, stood as a testament to his taste for spectacle. Yet beneath the grandeur, hollowness reigned. George had little interest in governance, allowing ministers to shoulder the burdens of policy while he retreated deeper into indulgence. His contribution to national affairs was cosmetic, a flourish of pageantry rather than substance. Parliament grew weary of his demands for money, and the public, already suffering from post-war economic hardship, saw his extravagance as proof of selfishness. In the glitter of his court, George mistook style for statesmanship. He wore jewels as if they could disguise neglect, staged ceremonies as if they could substitute for leadership. His efforts to elevate monarchy into an art form only sharpened the contrast with the reality of his rule. Absent, expensive, and alienated from the people he governed. For all his cultural achievements, his reign was branded with ridicule. Satirical prints depicted him as bloated and effete, a man more married to luxury than to his kingdom. Even those who admired his taste in architecture admitted his personal reputation undermined his accomplishments. To the eyes of history, George I's reign was less about progress than about the gulf between image and reality. Thus, the king who draped himself in silk and stone left a legacy that gleamed on the surface, but rang hollow at its core. His throne was built not on trust or duty, but on illusion, and illusions, no matter how radiant, eventually shatter. If George failed to win the affection of his subjects, he fared no better within his own family. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick had soured from its very beginning, but once he became king, the conflict erupted into scandal. George sought to exclude her from the coronation, denying her the title of queen and barring her from Westminster Abbey. Caroline, defiant, attempted to attend the ceremony, only to be turned away at the gates in front of jeering crowds. The people, who despised George's excess, rallied behind Caroline. To them, she symbolized resistance against a king who squandered their money and mocked their values. Riots broke out in her name, pamphlets celebrated her defiance, and the monarchy itself appeared split in two. A king who demanded loyalty and a queen who embodied popular sympathy. But George pressed on. He launched an investigation into her alleged infidelities, hoping to disgrace her publicly. The Queen's Trial of 1820 captivated the nation. Its sordid testimonies aired like theater across newspapers and taverns. For George, it was meant to be her downfall. Instead, it became his. The spectacle deepened public contempt, painting him as vindictive and petty, while Caroline gained reluctant admiration. Even beyond his marriage, George clashed with siblings and courtiers. His arrogance alienated allies, and his obsession with appearances eroded trust. The palace, meant to be the seat of unity, became an echo chamber of intrigue and hostility. In trying to humiliate his wife, George had only humiliated himself. The episode revealed his greatest flaw. He could not distinguish between personal vengeance and public duty. The private bitterness of his household spilled into the streets of London, corroding what little dignity remained of his crown. Years of indulgence left a merciless imprint on George's body. By middle age, he had grown grotesquely obese, his once celebrated figure swallowed by layers of flesh. Reports estimated his weight at over 120 kilograms, a mass that strained his joints and robbed him of mobility. He required special contraptions, cranes and hoists, to maneuver into bed, a spectacle that turned whispers of ridicule into open mockery. Alcohol and rich food were his constant companions. He devoured extravagant banquets of meat, cream, and wine, each feast pushing him further into decline. Laudanum, the opium-laced tincture he consumed for pain, blurred his mind and enslaved his body. Where once he had danced across glittering halls, George now shuffled heavily, his breath labored, his face perpetually flushed. Observers noted the tragic contrast. The prince, once hailed as the first gentleman of Europe, now reduced to a swollen parody of himself. His vanity, however, refused surrender. He continued to cloak himself in silks and jewels, hiding decay beneath fabric, as if appearances might still command respect. But clothes could not disguise the truth. His corpulence became a living emblem of the excesses that had consumed both his body and his reign. Beyond the physical pain lay mental torment. Laudanum dulled his senses, yet paranoia and melancholy crept in. He oscillated between bursts of arrogance and spells of gloom, unable to reconcile the image he cherished with the ruin he had become. Even those who once indulged his whims began to recoil. Ministers grew impatient, courtiers whispered of decline, and foreign dignitaries viewed him with thinly veiled contempt. George's body was not simply failing, it was testifying. Each swollen limb, each breathless gasp, each groan of pain was evidence of a life spent in pursuit of indulgence rather than restraint. His body had become his greatest betrayer, revealing to the world what he had always tried to hide: that the crown, like his health, was crumbling from within. As illness tightened its grip, George withdrew into isolation. In his final decade, the monarch rarely appeared before the public, preferring to vanish into the dim interiors of Windsor Castle and Carlton House. Gone were the glittering parties and candlelit concerts. In their place stretched corridors of silence, punctuated only by his labored breathing and the creak of attendants moving cautiously around him. The nation he ruled grew weary of his absence. Newspapers mocked his seclusion, portraying him as a recluse drowning in luxury while his people toiled. Where once his extravagance had been scandalous entertainment, it now inspired disgust. He was no longer a figure of fascination, but of contempt, a man who had barricaded himself from the very world he was meant to lead. Inside his gilded prisons, George found little comfort. His estranged wife, Caroline, had died in 1821, her passing barely acknowledged by a husband who had spent years trying to erase her. His siblings, weary of his arrogance, kept their distance. Even his beloved daughter, Princess Charlotte, had died tragically young, leaving him without a direct heir and deepening his despair. Loneliness grew heavier than his crown. He surrounded himself with courtiers who catered to his vanities but offered no real companionship. The feasts and performances he once adored were abandoned. Even music, once his solace, fell silent. The man who had craved constant distraction now faced the cruelest reality of all: himself. In those quiet years, George IV became a ghost within his own palaces. Windows were shuttered, doors closed, and public appearances nearly non-existent. The image of a radiant prince had faded into that of a swollen, sickly monarch haunted by regret. To the world outside, he was already half forgotten. His reign reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in taverns and caricatured in print. By 1830, George IV's body had become a prison swollen with disease. He suffered from dropsy, edema caused by heart failure, that left his legs and abdomen grotesquely distended. His belly filled with fluid, pressing on his lungs until each breath was a battle. At night he could not lie down, for the weight of his own body threatened to suffocate him. Instead, he slept upright, slumped in chairs like a man already half in the grave. The once vigorous prince had been reduced to a spectacle of decay. His skin, stretched and waxy, revealed the toll of years of indulgence. Attendants reported the smell of sickness in his chambers, the air heavy with medicines and despair. Even his doctors, frustrated by his refusal to change, could only watch as his condition worsened. On June 26, 1830, in Windsor Castle, the final act arrived. Racked by chest pain and gasping for air, George's heart gave out. Witnesses recorded his last moments as agonizing, his swollen form convulsing before death brought silence. He was 67 years old. News of his passing was met not with widespread mourning, but with relief. Bells tolled across England, yet the sorrow was muted. Many of his subjects remembered him less as a king than as a caricature, an emblem of excess who had squandered fortune, health, and dignity. His death seemed less a tragedy than an inevitability, the logical conclusion of a life lived without restraint. The man once hailed as Europe's most fashionable prince ended as a cautionary tale. His body told the story better than any historian could. A figure inflated by indulgence until it burst beneath the weight of its own corruption. George IV's legacy is one of contradiction. On the one hand, he left behind enduring contributions to Britain's cultural landscape. The glittering royal pavilion at Brighton, the grandeur of Regent Street, and the restoration of Windsor Castle all bear his imprint. He fostered the Regency style that still defines an era of elegance in British art and architecture. Yet culture could not redeem character. To the people, he remained the first gentleman who became a bloated monarch, remembered less for creativity than for selfishness. His extravagance drained the treasury, his scandals discredited the crown, and his neglect of duty eroded respect for monarchy itself. The grandeur of his buildings stood in stark contrast to the emptiness of his rule. Even in death, his image fared poorly. Unlike monarchs who inspired loyalty or awe, George was mourned sparingly. The public remembered his corpulence, his debts, his petty feuds with his wife, and his endless indulgence. Historians often describe him not as a king who ruled, but as one who consumed wealth, consumed affection, consumed his own strength. The metaphor of his death, swollen, suffocated by his own excess, captured the essence of his reign. His body and his monarchy collapsed in the same way, inflated beyond measure, unable to sustain themselves. Today, George IV survives in memory not as a noble ruler, but as a symbol of decline, a warning carved in flesh and stone. His reign is a mirror of vanity, reflecting how power, when squandered on indulgence, can transform grandeur into grotesque ruin. His life reminds us that a crown without restraint is nothing more than a gilded cage, and that even kings cannot escape the consequences of excess.